Donkey Kong is one of the most iconic characters of all time. Whether you're personally a fan of the adventures of the tie-wearing gorilla, you can't deny he's up there on the list of popular video game icons. Donkey Kong is of course a Nintendo property, but it wasn't really until a British developer, a little-known company by the name of Rare, got their shot at the series that DK became what we know him as today. And in fact, Rare's design for Donkey Kong has carried us to the year of our Lord 2025, where Nintendo officially decided to part with the design in DK Bananza, still retaining elements of it, but attempting to reflect the original DK design from the olden days before Rare. But even with the new design, Rare's time with the character has influenced this series so much that the latest game is filled with nods back to those days. Today I want to take a look at the journey of Donkey Kong and talk about the legacy of Rare with the character. Let's start with the initial creation of the character. Development of Donkey Kong began in 1981 with the intention of converting a poorly selling arcade cabinet in North America by the name of Radar Scope into something with more appeal to gamers. The man for the job was Shigeru Miyamoto, who had previously been hired a few years prior as a concept artist for new toys and products with Nintendo. Mr. Miyamoto actually received his interview with President of Nintendo Hiroshi Yamauchi due to Miyamoto's father being a personal friend of his. Miyamoto went on to design housing units for the Color TV game series. It's noted he thought they were bad and aspired to make something better. Nintendo sort of jumped into the video game market and realized they could cash in on making Space Invader clones, which was widely popular in Japan at the time. Miyamoto did the character designs for these arcade games, and fast forward to Radar Scope, which Nintendo wanted to expand into the North American market, but obviously, it wasn't working. They weren't selling their Radar Scope units, so they tasked Miyamoto with reinventing and recycling these units into something new. Miyamoto was very interested in creating a video game that had a plot, and looked at his favorite films and animations for inspiration, and decided on Popeye being a great candidate for a game, with a hero saving a damsel in distress from an ape-like evil-looking man, and also being able to utilize a power-up when acquiring an item. Unfortunately, Nintendo couldn't acquire the license, and this forced Miyamoto to create original characters. This prompted him to create the lady who would eventually become Pauline, Jumpman who would become Mario, and of course, Donkey Kong. The name for Donkey Kong is partly inspired by King Kong, and the donkey in Japanese means stupid. So essentially, this character is called Stupid Gorilla. This arcade game became a smash hit, and Nintendo couldn't keep up with the demand. And of course, when you have a successful game, you need to create sequels, right? Donkey Kong Jr. spawned out of Miyamoto wanting people to play as Donkey Kong in the next game, but feeling the character was too big for what he wanted to do. So he created his son Jr. as the character. Then another sequel spawned with Donkey Kong 3, and ultimately a Game Boy game finishing off this era of Donkey Kong in 1994. And honestly, there were a few spin-offs like DK Jr. Math for some reason, but that's not really that important. Nintendo was riding high on the success of Super Mario and its NES ventures, and then it happened.
16-bit arcade graphics. You can't move this on Nintendo. Genesis does. 16-bit arcade action. You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does. Genesis does. Genesis does. Genesis does. Genesis does. 16-bit arcade hits. You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does. What Nintendo? The 16-bit Genesis system by Sega. Genesis does it all.
Nintendo had the Super Nintendo, but knew it needed good games to make it stand out against its blast processing competitor. Enter Rare, who had several successful titles on Nintendo platforms, even Sega as well. Nintendo was already impressed with the Stamper Brothers essentially reverse engineering the NES and pushing it to its limits, understanding the hardware as good as Nintendo itself, and also understanding Nintendo's style of game creation. The Stamper Brothers at the time knew things were changing in a different direction, and in an effort to create something with a wow factor and third dimensional, they invested in some silicon graphics machines. These were very expensive at the time, but utilizing these machines, they created a tech demo. This tech demo featured pre-rendered 3D sprites, which impressed Nintendo so much they bought a majority of stock in Rare, and asked them to revive Donkey Kong and give a fresh take on the character utilizing this technology. And so, Rare began work on a little game called Donkey Kong Country. The original Donkey Kong Country has to be one of the most significant games in the Donkey Kong franchise as to who Donkey Kong is, not only establishing modern Donkey Kong as a new character, but also crafting a narrative of Cranky Kong being the old arcade Donkey Kong. In addition to this, we get characters like Diddy Kong, Funky Kong, Candy Kong, and K. Rool. It also established side animal companions like Rambi, On Guard, and Espresso. The amount of lore and world building they established for Donkey Kong is incredible and only grew with each entry in the series. But looking back at the development of Donkey Kong Country, we can see all of the effort that went into it. They started development in 1993 and finished the game in about 18 months. It's incredible how much they accomplished with it. First, being the revolutionary graphics at the time. Using the Silicon graphics machines, Rare figured they can pre-render 3D models and compress them into two-dimensional sprites. Evidently, when this game was first revealed, people thought it was a title on the rumored new Nintendo console to be in development. This 3D pre-rendering technique is what gives DK Country its unique style and tone. That, and the fact it's filled with that Rare charm with over-the-top cartoony-like style. Shout out to the Rare team behind the character designs. DK will have things like his eyes pop out and funny expressions. Highly expressive faces is something Rare put in a lot of effort. It gives the character personality, on top of adding in his obsession for stockpiling bananas, and Rare also had the opportunity to revamp DK's design, which they wanted to modernize and give him personality. Miyamoto obviously having lots of ideas for what he should look like. And you may think the tie actually makes his first appearance here, but actually, Donkey Kong was sporting his tie earlier that year on the Game Boy sequel to the arcade series. Miyamoto himself created the concept of him wearing a tie in an effort to move him away from the antagonist to protagonist. The world of Donkey Kong Country didn't just end with the main characters. Stages and level design are all based on the Kong's unique island filled with different kinds of barrels that Cranky Kong has seemed to develop into a technology for navigating the island. The entire adventure is based off of you exploring the island, uncovering secrets, and ultimately chasing out the bad guys. And speaking of, this is also the introduction of the different enemy types that populate the land, and notably, the Kremlings, who are invading the island to take the banana horde. Seemingly to eat them, or to starve the Kongs out and take over the island? Maybe both? Hard to say for sure as the reason seems to change. But establishing K. Rool as the villain and giving him this awesome character design is a huge step for the DK series as a whole. This becomes a story essentially about King Kong versus Godzilla, and I can't shake that since I noticed it. DK's design here from 1994 will be the base foundation for any 3D iteration of the character until 2025. And it wouldn't be a good look at the series if I didn't talk about the music. This is some of the most iconic music of all time in video games. While everyone seems to glaze aquatic ambience, I actually really love the main theme and the original Jungle Hyjinx track. It's just so happy and bouncy, gets me moving and grooving. And this game wasn't just about DK. He's got a family, namely his nephew Diddy Kong, who becomes the protagonist of the next entry in the series. And while DK and Diddy Kong recovered the banana horde from K. Rool together in Donkey Kong Country, and Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest, the story continues right where the first game left off, this time centering around DK being captured and Diddy Kong needing to go save him. Diddy Kong isn't alone though, as he is joined by his girlfriend Dixie Kong. The fundamental gameplay of Country 2 remains the same as the first. You have two swappable Kongs that each have a specific moveset. Although, where in Country you swap between DK as the heavy character and Diddy as the faster, lighter character, in Country 2 you had two light characters as Diddy and Dixie had similar body types. Diddy ultimately is a little faster and straightforward with his attacks, while Dixie is a bit slower and has a hover move with her hair. Dixie ends up catering to beginners, and Diddy is more for the skillful players who want to go as fast as possible. Once again, the soundtrack here is incredible by David Weiss, and we also need to credit Eveline Fischer, who worked on the soundtracks with him. The overall vibe and tone in DKC2 though strikes me as darker, and certainly has a bit more emphasis on the pirate theme, which naturally comes from the Kremlings being pirate themselves basically. It's fun to explore Crocodile Isle and ships and encounter ghosts and all sorts of bizarre enemies. The new additions in this one are also mainstays. Wrinkly Kong pops up in this one, as well as Swanky Kong, who looks very suspiciously like Donkey Kong. And also a few new animal companions like Squitter and Rattly. But anyways, we have to defeat K. Rool, who has his captain persona on in this one, and rescue DK. And while development of the original Donkey Kong Country took 18 months, the established assets and gameplay formula allowed the team to create Donkey Kong Country 2 in a year, or possibly even less, as it released in November of 1995, exactly 1 year after the original. And less than 1 year after that release, they already released a new game in the series, Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Sort of following the same approach this time for the third sequel, they added a new Kong, Kiddy Kong, who's Dixie's cousin, and this time, her and him have to save DK and Diddy from K. Rool, who's acting like a mad scientist this time. We're back to a light character who is faster and a heavy character who is powerful, only this time it feels very different between the two. The game also introduced the Northern Cremasphere, expanding even further on the DK world, and even introducing us to the Brothers Bears, who bear a striking resemblance to another rare character, as well as introducing some hub world puzzles of finding specific items and giving them to whoever can use them to open up paths and such. It's a neat little addition. This is the first time our path isn't 100% linear, level to level selection, as it has a sort of exploration element. We also see a few more animal buddies and of course, banger music. This time the music was headed by Eveline Fischer and David Wise supported. The overall vibes and tone in this country game in particular seem different yet again. Where the first one is an island with tropical and jungle elements, the second was dark and pirate themed. This one is the most country-like in my opinion. We go through different environments that capture that feel, like a log cabin out in the middle of the mountains. That's the kind of vibe you get in this one, with a few mysteries to uncover. And while this isn't the end of the Country series, it is the end of Rare producing the direct Country series. Nintendo wouldn't revisit it again until 2010 with DK Country Returns, where Donkey and Diddy are the main playable characters. But Rare did embark on a few smaller titles for the Game Boy that are worth mentioning. DK Land 1, 2, and 3. These are all games that use the assets and gameplay of their respectively numbered Super Nintendo counterparts. However, these are actually original games with their own levels and storylines. It was an interesting take by Rare to recreate the experience on the 8-bit Game Boy, despite the limits of the portable handheld, rather than just making a simpler 8-bit title. There was also a Game Boy Color version of DK Country and GBA remakes as well. But now, this brings us to the bread and butter, in my opinion, the peak of Rare and its Donkey Kong world-building escapades, Donkey Kong 64. It is in fact a sequel to Donkey Kong Country 3, however this marks the series' shift into the third dimension, but properly. It actually started development though as a 2.5D game, sometime between late 1996 and early 1997. As the game was being made, they quickly found a few things. One, getting through the levels seemed super quick, and the leap between the SNES game and this new iteration graphically didn't seem all that impressive. Looking at the trend of 2D games moving into 3D, that's when they decided to shift it into 3D. And this switch meant they switched out some of the leads to members of Rare staff that had N64 experience. Notably, George Andreas, Banjo-Kazooie co-designer. The banjo influences got even deeper as the team brought in Grant Kirkhope to do the soundtrack. He not only remixed some of David Weiss's tunes, but expanded upon them, and was able to recapture the mood of these tracks to give DK64 a distinct, darker tone, which was in line with the Country series. The gameplay is also heavily changed from its 2D counterparts to more in line with what I'd call the standard Mario 64 platformer skill tree. Movement, attacks with the B button, a crouch, and a varied moveset of attack and jumping based on if you're using crouch. The only difference is, much like Banjo-Kazooie, they utilize crouch and the C buttons to offer special moves, and even adding some other special barrels with abilities for each Kong. And yes, the tag barrels are actually still here. Rather than having your partner Kong following you, they decided to implement it into 5 characters, and you can basically hot swap when you jump in one. And the characters? Well, DK is back in the starring role with Diddy Kong, but we also see 3 new Kongs, Lanky, Tiny, and Chunky. With Linky having ties to the shunned Manky Kongs from Donkey Kong Country, and Tiny being Dixie's sister and Chunky being Kiddy's brother. Why they didn't use Dixie and Kiddy is a bit of a mystery, but I certainly adore this cast. And the main villain is of course K. Rool, who this time wants to destroy DK Isle, so it's up to us to stop him and get back our stolen bananas. Same old, same old. I believe he stole this as a distraction though in this game so he could have time to charge his laser. The game is an amazing collectathon, and it certainly has a ton to collect. It's actually one of the things they tried to do to separate it from other platformers, even among their own catalog. Just add a crap ton of collectibles. I mean, sounds good to me. I'm actually a big defender of this game, so if you're on the fence about it, go watch my Defending DK64 video and see if I can't get you to play this game. But regardless, the release of Donkey Kong 64 and all its expansion pack goodness ends Rare's time with Donkey Kong, minus the few GBA remakes that came after this game. And since then, DK has gone on to play many sports, party on to his heart's content, and even return back to his old country. But it hasn't been quite the same. And in fact, looking at DK since then, he's had this sort of meh quality about him in my opinion, especially in the spin-off titles. There's actually only one Donkey Kong game that I played where I felt, yes, this is the vibes of Rare DK, Donkey Kong Junglebeat. This is one I don't see appreciated enough. It's got a gimmicky control scheme for sure, but it works. It has that quality of wanting to come back to it and explore more. And most importantly, the vibes match up with the Country series. It's got a different look, don't get me wrong, but it follows the consistently dark tone. And that's what I think helps separate it from all the games released after it involving DK. This game was a gem, and I believe it was able to retain the vibes because it was the first platformer to be released after Rare didn't work on the series. Nintendo wasn't pushing for something totally different. Sure, different can be good, but sometimes it's unnecessary. I think there isn't anything wrong with making more of what works and expanding upon it, which is what Rare did from Donkey Kong Country 1 to 3 and even 64. This methodology is probably why I like games like Majora's Mask over Ocarina of Time or Tears of the Kingdom over Breath of the Wild, even if that might be a hot take to some of you. Familiar, but with a twist. And now with the release of Donkey Kong Bananza, and Nintendo moving past the Rare design, I find myself yearning for the time Rare was at the helm. I mean, even looking past my loving Rare bias, there's something that just didn't click with me playing Bananza. I see it glazed across social media as the greatest platformer, and while I do think it's good, I still will go back and appreciate DK64 as the 3D Donkey Kong of choice. Nostalgia does play a bit of a factor, but I think it's just plain good. Because as I'm playing Bananza, what I was hoping for was the same feelings I got when I pop in a Rare DK game, but it ended up feeling very much like Mario, which isn't a bad thing, but it doesn't feel like DK to me. More like Mario with DK aesthetics. It's hard to convey these feelings in words sometimes. While they changed my boy, I can look past DK's redesign as I don't find it too dramatic of a departure. Although I will say the fan reimagining with the Rare design still hits way harder. Something about the eyes. Even if the argument is made to be more expressive. And no one is looking past Diddy's weird skin gap between his eyes, this feels like it should be fixed because I hate it, otherwise he looks just fine. I'm not a huge fan of the stylistic choices aligning it with Mario Odyssey, which feels very Nintendo, and way less how I've come to know Donkey Kong over the years. But I will say it's a lot better than how he's looked in sports titles and kart games. The music and the plot were both something I really appreciated in Bananza, especially the ending and bringing back K. Rool. When I got to this section in particular, it felt very Rare. Retaining the old design for K. Rool, just bringing him up to a modern day, and adding a sort of lucrative plot point to why he's been gone, I loved this. And actually online, I saw a lot of people say this was their favorite part of the game. The very ending. The part that I think feels the most Rare, the most nostalgic, the most like classic Donkey Kong Country. The gameplay of Bananza was fun and satisfying to dig around and look for things, though I did have some camera issues time to time. For me, the level design is where this game falls fairly flat. Some are better than others, and with this new DK Isle DLC, I'm loving the look of it, as it calls back to a bit of the time of DK64 with a little bit of a modern twist. But the majority of levels in the game are these floating big rocks with themes, you spend a majority of the time underground digging and not really soaking in a lot of the level. That's the thing about DK Country and 64. The world was a big draw. You literally were traveling across the country in different environments that all felt distinct and cohesive at the same time, and in addition, adding a lot of mystery. It was the combination of retaining that dark tone across the country games with brilliant vibey music reflecting the world and also having the cartoony aspect of characters. Bananza essentially takes the old music to fill in the gaps, makes a nostalgic pull at our hearts, and it generally works, but it completely disregards the darker tones and moody atmosphere that made the country games feel like country games. It's all in on the cartoony aspect and none in the other stuff. And this wasn't meant to be an I dislike Bananza section of the video, as it could come across, because I do like Bananza. And I support more 3D DK games for sure. It just doesn't hold a candle to the old DK games when Rare was at the helm. For me, Donkey Kong was at his best when he was with Rare. I know times change and we have to accept the changes and move forward, but we can always look back fondly and appreciate the good old days when Donkey Kong was exploring his country and Rare was with Nintendo. I still think to this day the DK64 rendered image is peak DK design. What do you think? What's your favorite Donkey Kong game? That's all I have for you. I hope you'll banana slammer that like button and subscribe so you don't miss a future upload. Until next time, have a good one. Jiggylookback!